Hello! So one of you asked in one of the videos that I recently made if I could recommend great books, basically books that stand the test of time but might not be super popular and that you might not be aware of. And so this is what that video is going to be, is I'm going to recommend you some great books. The first book on that list is going to be On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. I think he's a psychologist in the army now, but he used to be in the special forces. This book is not written as a terrific book, and it is a bit repetitive in some places, and arguably too simplistic in some places. It actually suffers from a lack of sophistication. But it is a great book nonetheless because it is one of the only books that actually deals with the topic of this book, the thesis of this book, and he even mentions that there's a lack of research on this topic. And the idea is, it takes neuroscience and psychological research and explores the impacts that killing has on both society and individuals, how we teach people to kill, and how society in some way actually encourages people to kill. That's the overview of the book. One great example of how this book covers the topic of killing is in chapter 1, where he discusses our resistances towards killing. He goes over research about how the army has to invent new techniques to actually encourage us to kill because we have an innate resistance towards killing. In that chapter, he discusses, for example, the firing rates of soldiers compared to World War I, World War II, or Vietnam, or even modern conflicts in the Middle East, and that the firing rate was much higher as time went on because there was an innate resistance towards killing, and we didn't have very scientific methods to actually convince soldiers to overcome that innate resistance towards killing. So soldiers in World War I, let's say you had 100,000 of them, let's say only 1,000 of them would fire. Whereas in Vietnam, if you had 100,000 soldiers, 80,000 of them would fire. In addition to this, we also have evidence of this innate resistance to killing, as he mentions, by simply looking at the new techniques that the Army has developed. The continuous innovation that the Army engages in is evidence to the fact that there is a resistance that they are trying to overcome. So for example, they have new ways of training. He said in World War I, what we would do is we condition soldiers to tolerate death. In World War II, we conditioned soldiers to cause death. We got them used to causing death. We went from shooting at paper targets to shooting at hyper-realistic ballistics gel targets that have human organs inside them, and when you shoot them, the human organs blow out just like a real human. And we also have really hyper-realistic simulations that we also use to train soldiers in. In addition to this, the way that the Army has changed the language that soldiers use is another piece of evidence to support that we need new ways to innovate people's natural resistance towards killing. We went from maybe calling it let's say you're fighting the Germans, to now fighting enemies or fighting combatants or targets. And in some cases you actually use derogatory terms. A great example of this might be like the American pigs. You wouldn't call them people or humans with families, you would call them American pigs, right? And Grossman also notes that in a few wars we actually gave drugs to soldiers with the explicit purpose of saying that it'll make them more alert and effective in combat, but there was a side effect, which was probably their real intentional purpose, of making their moral judgments looser, being more willing to take risks in combat, and actually being more willing to engage in combat in general. We did it in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Gulf War. And the last piece of evidence that he cites as this innate resistance towards killing is the concept of moral injuries, not just stress-related injuries, like if you kill someone, you have a stress-related injury, and now you have PTSD. He's talking about moral injuries where when after somebody kills another person, they actually experience moral guilt for a very long time after the fact, sometimes years after the fact. And it can be if they kill one person, it could be even if they harm one person, they can experience what is called a moral injury. So for that general topic of the innate resistance towards killing, I always had a suspicion that this existed, but then Grossman actually goes into the research, presents this point, and he presents a lot more points on the topic of killing. It's all, of course, related to warfare, and so that is a bit of a drawback. But because there's not many other books that actually go into this topic, I think this is a great book. There aren't a lot of researchers who discuss the ideas in this book. The next book is Wrights, and this book is also on here not because the book itself is terrific and grand. It's because nobody talks about the topic. And it's one of the few books on the topic, at least that I'm aware of. I'm sure I bought this book maybe 3 years ago, so I'm sure the topic is expanded somewhat, But when I first bought this book, it was one of like a unique kind. And the ideas in the book are actually great. So on the one hand, he talks about whether we should be granting robot rights or not based off of the idea that in the future, there's going to be a blurring. That even if the machine is not conscious, we might not be able to determine whether it is conscious or not based on the way we're interacting with it. So think about like a really sophisticated chatbot on the internet. We might not want people to be able to indiscriminately behave in inappropriate ways under the presumption that it is a chatbot or that it is an AI software when it is in fact a human, right? So we might want to grant some minimal rights to robots to avoid sticky situations where the person thought they were interacting with an AI software and it turns out to be a human after the fact. In addition to this, he also says that we should consider the possibility that machines could have some level of minimal consciousness, and if that is the case, then we should also consider what kind of rights we're going to grant to them. Another very interesting point is the idea that AI is going to be really integrated into our life, or robots in general be really integrated into our life. And so in some sense, they'll be an extension of who we are, and we wouldn't want our rights to be like trampled on. Now here's like an easy way to understand this. It's not like the best example, but it's an easy example to understand. Imagine you have like this iRobot future where your robot goes out and submits your vote for you, okay? You wouldn't want your voting rights to be tarnished because they didn't let your machine vote for you, right? Maybe you give the machine your ticket, whatever, your instructions, and it goes and votes for you. That's like an iRobot type of future. And so in that sense, you would want your rights to be extended to your machine, right? To your software, to your robot, whatever, in that sense. So as technology becomes more integrated into our lives and therefore becomes an extension of us as people, we should consider also extending the rights to the machines themselves, not to protect the machines, but to protect our rights as they're being expressed through various forms of property. Another really interesting point was also, if we extend the rights to machines, it might encourage ethical development of machines. If we can't just do whatever we want with machines and we have to treat them as though we were humans, we might actually have more responsible AI development or robot development as opposed to if it's just property and we can do whatever we want with it to the extent that property law allows us, or so on and so forth. You might have more careless and more risky behaviors associated with development. So for those reasons, this book is on here. The ideas are really interesting and not a lot of people talk about it. And even to this day, when I tell people about the ideas in this book, a lot of people get dismissive and laugh about it, but I think the ideas are valid and they should be considered to some extent. It's kind of like when now it's very popular after the book Lifespan by Sinclair and LaPlante that anti-aging is really popular now, but 10, 15 years ago, people would laugh about that and dismiss you. And now all of a sudden it's accepted. I feel like this is like an analogous situation where the concept of robot rights is probably going to be laughed at for the next 10, 15 years, but in 25 years from now, people will take it seriously. The next book is The Great Mother by Erich Neumann. He has a few good books. This book is a bit esoteric, but a lot of academics talk about it. And Jung actually said that Neumann was the person who he wanted to be, in the sense that Origins in the History of Consciousness is a book that Jung would have wanted to write. And I think The Great Mother is another book that Jung would have wanted to write. So the idea in The Great Mother is that there is this archetype called the Great Mother, and the Great Mother archetype is this source of nurturing or life sustenance, and that it provides basically nutrition or value or protection or vitality to not only humans but life in general. That is the Great Mother archetype. And the Great Mother archetype, Neumann argues, has shaped a lot of human culture, society, and general development. And here are just some examples. In Greek mythology, you have Gaia, who is like the goddess of Earth, like Mother Earth. She's protective and nurturing. In Hinduism, you have Durga, who is also a goddess. She's also depicted as being protective and nurturing. In ancient Egypt, you had Isis, who was considered the mother of all pharaohs and the protector of life. In Native American culture, you had the Earth Mother, and the Earth Mother is basically also protective and nurturing. It's viewed as like the earth itself. And in Chinese mythology, you have Guanyin, I forget how it's pronounced, but basically she is also protective and nurturing, and she represents all the caring aspects of the feminine psychology. So essentially, this book explores all the different myths around the Great Mother archetype, because he argues that this is like a fundamental archetype in human psychology, like a primal archetype, and he explores how it's been expressed in different cultures, such as ancient Greek, ancient Egypt, Chinese, Native American, etc., etc., etc. Now, the last book, which is a really interesting book, because it's basically what like a people's history of the United States wanted to be, as the back cover says, and I agree with that, because this book tells it's a people's histories of the world, a people's history of the world, and it tells history from the point of view of groups of people. So the book explores basically themes like classism, elitism, and so on and so forth, like wealth inequality and land ownership. And it says that we have a tendency to tell history from those who are in power. What this book tries to do is tell history from the point of view of those who are not in power. So for example, if we go into Europe, the peasants and the serfs were really important for pushing towards more modern notions of democracy. The rebellions and uprisings they engaged in were really important for modern democracy. If we go to the Industrial Revolution, we have the workers and laborers who engaged in strikes, laying the foundations for unions, right? Unionization, basically getting together to argue for workers' rights or laborers' rights. The workers in the Industrial Revolution did that, not the higher-ups, not like the capitalists or the fat cats. And he even goes to like the 20th century, where you have civil rights movements pretty much laying down the foundation for modern civil rights as we understand it. That's the idea in this book. The people's history of the people's history of the world is to look at the less privileged, or the people, so to speak, of history, and look at how it is that they shaped history, as opposed to looking at like, I don't know, Winston Churchill and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, right? Instead of looking at these people, let's look at the lower classes of people who were pretty much big parts of history that we can't ignore. And so for that reason, this book is really great. Another really terrific book that I think most people should read is C.P. Snow, The Two Cultures. So I found this book by reading Steven Pinker's book, and he cites this book. And the idea in this book is actually, it might be familiar to you already if you've gone to like a university setting, but the idea is that there's a divide between the humanities and the sciences, and this divide is not fruitful. What you have is a lot of scientists who know nothing about the humanities. They don't know how to interpret literature. They're not familiar with the great writers, or even some of the humanitarian philosophies or something like this, okay? And they tend to be very anti-rationalism. Whereas the scientists will know a lot about empiricism, have a lot of facts, and the humanities people won't know anything about these basic facts. And as a result, the humanitarian theorists will never include these basic facts into their rationalist philosophies or humanitarian philosophies or humanist philosophies, right? That's the idea, that there's two cultures and that there's a divide and that we need to bring them together. And this is a unique book because it deals with that topic explicitly. I've read essayists like Emerson or Montaigne or Francis Bacon who will tangentially mention this distinction, but never delve into it with like a 100-page long book. This is actually a lecture, and they turned it into a book. And so, for that reason, I think this is a great book. It's very unique, and I think it's worthwhile reading, especially for people who like to read both science and philosophy, or go and dig through empirical studies and then read rational frameworks afterwards. So those are some of the great books from my shelf. They're basically books that I think will stand the test of time. The first two are not the best written books, but the other ones definitely are really wonderfully written. And the ideas in those books, I think, are not super common. Even like taking a people's history of history, like viewing a people's point of view on history, is not super popular. I seldom find books that are written like that. The only two that I know of, no, I know of three, right? The one is People's History of the World, People's History of the United States, and then Neil Ferguson's The Square of the Tower. I'm not a history expert, so this could be my own ignorance, but as far as I've seen, a lot of books are written like that. A lot of books are usually written from the point of view of a state or some powerful figures, or some trends in general. But at any rate, I'm not rambling, so with that being said, bye-bye.